Hi everyone, thanks for having me. I'm very happy to be here at the Magento Stammtisch today, and I'm going to talk about Redis and how it can be used within Magento, talking about high availability and high performance and what may slow down your e-commerce shops. So let's start up with an agenda. First of all, I want to apologize for all the native speakers here. This is my second talk in English, so please be kind.
Always.
Yes. We're starting off with a short introduction about myself and the company I work for. Then we're diving into what is Redis, different kinds of Redis, like Redis Cluster and Redis Sentinel, and how it can be used within Magento. Then some kind of a tuning guide, and later on we are going to see some common pitfalls which you might be doing wrong or might have experienced in production environments. Yes, and then at the last point we are doing some Q&A stuff. So it's me, Konrad Androsch. I'm a sysadmin, or today you would call it the DevOps Engineer, working at Internex GmbH. We are a managed cloud service provider offering a wide variety of services targeting mid and large scale enterprises, doing their IT services starting from only small domain or web space hosting with up to complex cluster environments and IT setups. Yeah, so we're also an ISO 27001 certified company. And we are running 3 data centers within Austria, but also can offer hosting infrastructure worldwide. For myself, I'm working and deploying Magento since 2014, so roughly 10 years from now. And at this point, many thanks to Phoenix Media for writing the Varnish plugin back in the days for Magento 1. It really helped me a lot and made customers really happy, which had performance issues.
You're so welcome.
So let's start off with Redis. What is it? Yes, the first one is taken from Wikipedia. So it's an in-memory data structure store, which basically means you can put in whatever you like, giving it a name and then storing a value to it. And it's stored into memory or RAM, so it can be accessed very fast. Therefore, it's perfectly fit for session or cache storage. It was initially developed by Salvatore Sanfilippo, and the first release was in May 2009. It's an open source software licensed under BS3 clause, and it's written in C, which is why it's so blazing fast. Yeah, as mentioned before, it's a key value database, but not all of that. It's also a message broker, so you can think of it like a RabbitMQ, so it can implement publish and subscribe modules. You can also store strings, of course, lists, maps, sets, sorted sets, hash maps, whatever you like. So it's a really battle-tested solution, and you see it in large-scale infrastructure everywhere. Reddit is using it, Facebook is using it, whatever social media network you can think of. So it's a very heavily used software, and it's really robust. So yeah, as mentioned before, primary usage will be cache storage or session storage. That's what it's used for within Magento 2. So how does it work? Initially, a client does a request against the application. The application would check if it already has the requested data within the cache. So it queries the Redis database for specific keys. And if it's hitting a cache entry, then it just returns the cache. If it does not have it in its cache, then it's going to look up the data within a MySQL database, for example, then primes the cache with the data it fetched just from the database, and then returns to the client. And all several requests for the same data will be served from Redis, and therefore be fast and will reduce the load on your database service. But there's a problem with Redis. If it's just one instance, you might be facing a single point of failure. So if your Redis goes down, you might be in trouble. So there's a solution for that, basically two solutions. They get mixed up very often, so I want to start off with a definition, comparing Redis Cluster and Redis Sentinel. Redis Cluster is basically if one machine does not have enough RAM to store your data set, you are needing some solution which is able to scale horizontally. So you can have many number of nodes which you define to be a cluster. The technology used for is called sharding. So you split your database or your keys within some slices or small pieces. And then there's a hash slot within the cluster, which is assigned to different nodes. All in all, you have about 16,000 of that. And theoretically, you could assign one slot to one Redis node and therefore scale it almost indefinitely. But yeah, usually in an e-commerce setup, you won't have that much data in your cache. Otherwise, you are doing something wrong. So it's possible to have multiple master instances, and the logic how the master which writes the defined hash slot, I'm going to talk in a second about that. But yeah, the feature is deprecated in the CM cache backend Redis, which is provided from Colin Mollenauer. So we are not going to use that within Magento, unfortunately. But here is how it would work. It's a really cool logic because the client calculates an hash of the key and then knows in which slot he has to look for. So you don't need any additional service which tells the client where to look up the data. The client knows using a deterministic function to find his slot where it has to store or look the data up. Yeah, that's basically how the Redis cluster architecture looks like. As mentioned before, it's not used in Magento, so we're going for another one, which is Redis Sentinel. Redis Sentinel compared to Redis Cluster, where Redis Cluster is just a configuration on your running Redis instance. Redis Sentinel is a standalone process, an own binary, which you start maybe on the application server where your Redis instance is running, or you can start it on separate nodes too. And then you won't have multiple master instances. You just will have one primary node and then multiple replicas, how many you want. And the difference is that you don't have shards. All data is stored on your primary node, and Redis Sentinel is monitoring your primary node. And if it fails, if it does not respond to queries, it will do an election process and find a new master and announce this and does an automatic failover. So you just have to make sure you have a quorum within your cluster. So you should have an odd number of nodes. So let's say 3, 5, 7, whatever. And then, yeah, it just acts as a service discovery for your client. So your client can ask Sentinel who is the primary, and Sentinel will respond with the IP address, and then the lookup will continue there. So at least 3 instances are needed, and gladly it's supported by Magento. This is a short overview of the architecture. Yeah, your Sentinel nodes are constantly monitoring your primary, and if it's not responding, it will do an election process to find a new primary and then fail over. One thing to say about Redis in general, it does not have strong consistency, and it doesn't care about data you might lose if it crashes. So your replication might be lagging due to network issues, or just your replicas could not keep up with the disk IO or whatever, or mostly it's network traffic. Yes, and this will mean if the replica gets announced as a primary and was lagging before, you might lose some data. So you must keep this in mind if you store other things than cache data there. It's not really a full-fledged relational database like MySQL or Postgres is. Yeah, one overview of the service discovery. Here you can see your client application, which could be Magento, which is calling Sentinel or multiple Sentinel nodes for the master, for the primary, and then makes the request. The primary replicates its data to the slaves, and they can get announced as primaries too if the primary in charge is failing. So how do you configure it? That's a very basic configuration, assuming your Sentinel instance and your Redis instance are running on the same virtual machine. So you basically define your monitor set and give it a name. In this case, it's my master. And then you give it an IP address of your master and the Redis port. The last parameter 2 is the quorum. So you need at least 2 Sentinel nodes which agree on the master state. So they have to find a decision by finding a decision to agree on if a master is down or not. So you need at least 2 nodes of them. Then you can define how much milliseconds your master has to respond to queries in order to detect if it's up or down, and how long it does accept a failover how long does it take to failover. And the last one, the parallel syncs, is if a new slave joins the cluster, how much replicas at one time can replicate the data. So you should not set this number too high in order to keep your network usage low. So the Redis configuration of a replica is really easy. It's just one line, replica off, then you give it your initial master and its port. And after that, if your Redis instance and Sentinel instances are running, it's very low effort to keep it in sync and running, because Sentinel manages all of this and rewrites the configuration if a new master gets announced. So it's very easy. So, but how to use it within Magento? Yeah, first I would suggest to read the documentation, but surprisingly, the experience leak of Adobe is not that very verbose about how to use Sentinel. That's mostly all I've found there within the documentation. So only 4 configuration switches, and it's only related to session handling, but not a mention of how it can be used as a cache too. So if you're running a large-scale Magento cluster, you might want your cache not to be a single point of failure. So it was really surprising that I did not find more information about that. But nevertheless, Redis Sentinel for sessions could look like this. The most important parameters are the host and the port, which must be empty string, not null, and not an IP address. Otherwise, this would get picked up before the Sentinel server configuration. So you have the Sentinel master, which is basically the name of your master, like in the example before, it's my master, and the Sentinel servers, which is a comma-separated list of your Sentinel nodes. As you see, it's not the Redis port, it's the port 26379, which is the port where Sentinel is listening on. So from there on, Redis is not accessed directly in the first place by Magento, but Sentinel is, and Sentinel tells Magento where to look for its primary. The Sentinel verify master flag is to check if the master is really responding before writing data to it. So it's a safeguard, so to say. So you can enable this. Yeah. As I mentioned, I did not find anything in the docs for Sentinel caching within Magento, but under the hood, it's using basically the CM Redis cache backend from Colin Mollenauer, and Magento is extending this with the cache backend Redis, which adds additional features like cache preloading. Watch that later. Yeah, gladly the parameters or variables which are used in the library beyond are also possible to use within the configuration. So you can just do some small adaptations to your backend configuration for the frontend cache or for the default cache, so to say. And you define your server with an array of Sentinel nodes. So yeah, that's basically it. And then you would be good to go using Sentinel in production for sessions and caching. And the load from slaves flag means if your replicas are also used for read queries or not. 0 will not use them for read queries. 1 will only use slaves for read queries, and 2 will use your master and your replicas or slaves for read queries. Okay, so how would you tune that setup more further? It could be a bottleneck if you're talking to one set or only one primary for all your databases. So if it's busy using handling sessions and handling the cache, it can get stuck or it can be a bottleneck there. So you might want to use multiple Redis instances. It's really easy to add a second set within a Sentinel, which gets monitored too. So you can spawn multiple database indexes in multiple Redis instances, which are monitored by Sentinel, and then can be used in Magento, one for the session, one for the cache, whatever you like. Then there's a cool feature called cache preloading within Magento, which is leveraging technology which Redis is supporting since a long time, which is called pipelining, which basically means in order to reduce the network round trip time, which it takes for one request to receive at your Redis instance and then gets fetched and return, you can, if you have to do this for 10 keys, you have the network round trip every time. With pipelining, you can do this in one go. So you can write all 10 GET requests in one go and then fetch it in one time. So you have the network round trip only once. So if it's 10 milliseconds, it would add up with 10 keys to 100 milliseconds, but with pipelining, it would keep at 10 milliseconds, which is a really cool feature. It allows to enable, this is also Magento specific, a parallel generation of caches. So the basic setup would be that it's blocking, so only one thread can generate a cache if it's empty. This allows you to do it in parallel. Then there's a feature called level 2 or L2 cache, which is used for reduction of network traffic, and more on that later on a second slide. And in combination with that, you can use stale caching, which basically means if your cache is outdated and you have not renewed your cache yet, you can serve a stale cache request for some time. So how does the cache preload feature work? Building upon our configuration, which we saw first, we just added a second array, which is called Preload Keys beyond. And there you can put in basically every key. That's just a suggestion from the documentation, where you can put in keys which are used heavily and often by Magento. And yeah, thanks to the pipelining features, these 4 keys will get fetched within one request, and therefore the round trip will be minimal.
We have a question in the chat.
Yeah.
Björn is asking, how does the Magento instance benefit from this complex Redis setup? Any performance or scalability benchmarks?
I don't have scalability benchmarks within that talk, unfortunately, but it's mostly about high availability, I would say. So it's not faster if you use Sentinel or something like that, but it's mostly needed if you have a cluster with multiple nodes, multiple application servers which are serving your Magento application. You don't want to have a single point of failure within Redis, and you want to share your sessions. So you need some high availability there, that your users don't get locked out or something like that when Redis crashes. Does it answer your question? Okay. Good. Thanks. Yeah. Okay. So more to the level 2 cache. Yeah, as I said before, it's used to reduce the bandwidth. So if you're running a large-scale Magento cluster in a cloud service provider environment, for example, where you're paying by traffic or paying fees according to the amount of traffic you used, and keep in mind that Redis is heavily used by Magento, and in the documentation it says about 300 kilobytes per request are sent between Redis, and this traffic also needs to be replicated to a certain amount of slaves. You can only imagine how these $100K bills on your AWS account come up. So there's a cool feature which is called level 2 cache. It's leveraging the remote synchronized cache class by Magento. And basically it's the remote backend we saw before, which is also combinable. So you have your Redis Sentinel nodes still, and these are your main storage, your main cache storage, but you are also downstreaming your cache to a local backend. In this example, it's a cache directory on a temp file system or a shared file system in shared memory. So if Magento then looks up for the cache, it just looks there. And if the cache is still valid, it does not have to fetch it again from the remote storage or from the remote backend, and therefore saves bandwidth if it can look up the cache locally. Okay, so some pitfalls you might have already seen in production or might see them in the future. One common thing we often see is the eviction policy, which means when are keys purged from Redis. So if it's purged, if it's never purged, you might run out of memory sometime. So you might want to set a maximum amount of memory, which is Redis allowed to use. And if you're setting this policy, you might want to figure out which policy suits best. So maybe you might go for a last recently used set, which would then purge the keys which are not used heavily first, or least recently used, sorry. But this might lead to your sessions getting kicked out. So yeah, at internex, we are usually doing a max memory policy very high, and therefore monitoring it before it reaches that level, and then acting proactively, checking why the cache is getting filled up, and maybe extending it or just garbage collect some old entries. You might want to think about your backup strategy. So the default setting of Redis would be to save the cache to disk every 100 or 900 key changes within a certain amount of seconds. So if you have a highly loaded environment where with many hits per second, you might be saving all the time to the file system, and therefore blocking your I/O. And this is one thing to keep in mind. Maybe you have to increase the value there, not to save it too often. One common misconfiguration we see is mixed data. So you're putting your sessions and your cache within the same database index within Redis, which means if some developer is doing a Magento cache clear on the CLI, it also flushes out your sessions. So all your users getting logged out and all your cards are getting abundant, and that's not what you want.
Ouch.
Next thing is concurrency. The default setting is really low on that one. It's about 6, I think, which states how many PHP process can wait for a session lock to gain. And if it's set too low, you will end up having high load times because your PHP processes are waiting to gain a lock in order to use the session. You can completely disable session locking, which comes to the next thing. But you can also increase the concurrency to overcome this issue. Session locking is a good thing usually, so you don't want to disable it in the first place. Yeah, you might want to consider it before doing so, but it's up to the environment and your circumstances. Last thing is compression. The default compression algorithm is gzip compression, which is heavily used, but not the best one to use. It's using CPU cycles, and the compression is not that good, so you might go for a better one, which are supported by Magento, like LZF or Snappy. But sometimes it's good to not compress at all. So it's depending on your use case. If you can afford the memory you use, then it might be better in order to save CPU cycles and time while it's doing compression and uncompression, decompression. So yeah, that's also a topic you should consider and monitor in your environment. Yeah, that would be basically it.